Welcome to our July 2017 webinar. We're happy to have the opportunity to speak with each of you today. We will have this webinar recorded, so you will be able to download it and listen to it again if you would like. And if you know someone that has missed the webinar and would like to watch it, they can certainly do that by just going to our website on the webinar page. We're very happy to welcome today Suzanne Bernier. She is the president of SB Consulting, Crisis Consulting, and she's also the author of Disaster Heroes. Suzanne is a multi-certified, award-winning, and internationally recognized crisis management consultant, speaker, and author who has helped governments, communities, and companies plan for and respond to disasters for over 20 years. She was named 2016's Continuity and Resilience Consultant of the Year in North America by Business Continuity Institute, and also had the honor of being the guest speaker at the White House in the United States during FEMA's 2016 Individual and Community Preparedness Awards. Throughout her career, Suzanne has been professionally and personally involved in helping communities respond, rebuild, or recover from numerous crises, including the San Bernardino, the Brussels, the 9/11 terror attacks, the 2016 Fort McMurray, the Alberta wildfire, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the H1N1 epidemic, or pandemic I should say, and the 2003 Northeast blackout, as well as the 1998 ice storm of the century in eastern Canada. In addition, she has helped to support numerous floods, fires, and severe storms. Prior to her career in business continuity and emergency management, Suzanne was a journalist, press secretary, and media spokesperson for the Canadian government. Suzanne's critically acclaimed book, Disaster Heroes, tells the stories of ordinary men, women, and children who've done extraordinary things to help respond and recover and rebuild following some of the world's most significant modern disasters. She is currently working on several new projects, including her next book, Disaster Heroes 2. We welcome you, Suzanne, today to our webinar.
Thanks very much, Linda. It's great to be here.
We have some webinar objectives, and she's going to look at how to review crisis communications and lessons learned from disasters. She's going to discuss crisis communications concepts and principles, review the 10 steps in crisis communications, and discuss social media and emergency management. If you have questions during this webinar, you can use the questions button, and I'll be monitoring that button, and I will try to answer your questions online. And at the end of the webinar, if we have time, we'll also have some time for questions. If we don't get to your questions, we will share those with Suzanne, and she can reply to you individually. So let's go ahead and get started with our first poll. So which of the following best describes your job title or responsibilities?
Unmuted.
Linda and Suzanne, looks like we have about 61% of our viewers are a part of the business continuity risk management responsibilities. 18% are responsible for communications. 10% emergency management, and the last 10% is other.
Great, thanks. All right. I believe it's over to me, and on that note I am going to start going through the slides. We've got a lot of slides to go through, but it's because I really wanted to share with everybody as much as I could in the limited time that we have, because it's so important, the area and the aspect of crisis communications. As we see every time we either run an exercise or we go through an actual crisis event, one of the top things that comes up as far as needing to improve on always seems to be communications, whether it's internally or externally or interorganizationally. As a result, it's even more important than ever now that we look at and understand that we are in a new era of emergency management. And sorry about the scrolling of the slides there for a second. Now, in this new era of emergency management, when something bad happens, we have different choices. We have three choices. We can let it define us, let it destroy us, or let it strengthen us. And I believe all of you remember, at least over the last... Yes,
Suzanne, I don't think we can see your screen. Can you share your screen?
Sorry about that. And can someone just pass over the sharing function to me? Because I'm not seeing how I can do that here. Can you?
Hang on one second. I had sent it to you, so let me I'll have to take it back for a second.
Here. Sorry, everybody.
All right, now I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter again.
Great. There we go. All right, now everybody can see my screen, hopefully. And we've got that slide that says when something bad happens, we've got three choices. We let it define us, destroy us, or strengthen us. And I believe every one of us have seen examples over even just the past year of different companies, different organizations, communities that have made that choice. And we're going to take a look at some case studies, crisis communications case studies, and look at how and the choices that those companies made in this new era, not only a new era of crisis communications, but really a new era of business continuity and emergency management. And we're going to talk about why we're calling this a new era of business continuity and emergency management now. And now maybe we'll lead into the next poll question with this. So our next poll question is, which of the following workplace and workforce risks do you feel is the top risk organizations face today? And I'm sure that you'll probably agree when you go through the list of current risks that they've changed quite a bit. And the risks that we have in our workplace and our workforce today can be a lot different than what our risks were 5, 10 years ago. And sorry, we're waiting for the poll to open, or is it's already open?
It's open, and Suzanne, you have an astounding 77% of our viewers believe that cyber attacks are the highest risk. 15% believe extreme weather events. 8% is workforce violence, active intruder attacks, and that closes up the poll.
Perfect, thank you. And that doesn't surprise me at all. Over 60% of you recognize that cybersecurity now is a top risk that we have to be prepared for. And it's something that really wasn't a risk 20 years ago in the field, and now it's one of our top risks. Thank you. All right, so cybersecurity, we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges with our reliance on the internet and how we communicate now. And it's something that we also have to be recognize and be careful about. Nowadays, we have people who are wanting to hack into our information, not only for their own purposes to make money or for nefarious purposes, but also what we have to realize is whatever we have as a digital footprint now, whether it's an email we send out, a voicemail we leave for somebody, anything, a text message that we send to people, anything that's a technology-based communication, mode of communication can now be repeated, posted somewhere else for everybody to see. We've seen that repeatedly over the past year and a half, specifically in America. We've seen it in other areas across the world as well, and we're going to continue to see this. This is an increased risk. The more that we're reliant on the internet, cyber, the more we're going to have these risks. One of the things I wanted to relay to everyone is again, the importance of recognizing that whatever you share in an email or in any electronic method of communications, make sure that you would be all right with that being posted publicly. And a word of advice, would you be comfortable reading that email that you sent to somebody on CNN, on a headline in your local newspaper, or on the internet? If not, probably best if you don't send that email or that text or leave that voicemail message. Active shooter. We're not talking about active shooter and how to prepare and respond to active shooter events today. However, it does now create an additional communications challenge for us as business continuity and emergency management professionals, where this proves an additional challenge. Active shooter events happen very, very quickly, very sudden. We have potentially no advance warning for these. Because of it, we have to be very quick on how we respond. We have to look at and consider different ways to notify different people, our stakeholders, on what's happening, how to be safe, and raise awareness. Now we're looking at, there's emergency notification systems. Back in the 20 years ago, we relied on call trees. Now we need to rely on other methods of being able to rapidly disseminate information to our stakeholders as soon as possible to potentially save their lives. I wanted to share this brief example of a university in Newfoundland in Canada last year that had a challenge that they faced. That is something that, again, is specific now to this active intruder threat or increased threat that we are facing in communities across North America and the world. This specific one was a potential, there was a report on this campus, there was a potential active intruder on the campus. Now the communications department of the university, and we're going to talk a lot more about social media and now how that's changing the game in crisis communications, and how to be able to use social media effectively. But this is an example.
Can I interrupt you just for 1 second? This is Linda.
Sure.
We had one of our webinar attendees say that they had an active shooter today in Williamsburg and that they used Facebook to communicate to people there.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to hear of that news. But thank you for sharing how you chose to communicate. And I hope the communication was successful. This example that I'm talking about, fortunately, was not an active intruder incident. It was a potential report of an active intruder incident. Unfortunately, what happened was the crisis communications team at that university, they decided that they were going to use proactively social media. However, they only used social media, and what they decided to do was use Twitter and send out a tweet. However, the challenge is that if you're in a classroom and you're not necessarily checking your tweets, and if you're teaching, you're not going to be checking your Twitter account. So there was a message that went out, and this is the message that went out, the tweet that went out. It really doesn't say much, does it? I mean, it says the St. John's campus is closed until further notice, following reports of suspicious activity. It doesn't tell me what that suspicious activity is. There could be a life-threatening event. It doesn't tell me, should I be staying on campus? Should I be coming in or not? It really was a very vague message. And the only reason that the news started spreading because somebody was sitting in class and was randomly checking their Twitter account or their Twitter feed and then saw this message pop up. And that's when they started communicating to other people. But this ended up being the only way that university chose to communicate was through a tweet. And unfortunately, it didn't communicate very effectively. And there should have been other ways that they chose to communicate to their stakeholders, both internally and externally. They recognized afterwards that they do need to do a better job, and now they're looking at, and I'm sure they probably have implemented a notification system, a mass notification system, to be able to use a multitude of different ways to be able to communicate to all of your stakeholders. So just an example of a challenge that we now face that we may not have faced 10, 15 years ago. Another issue that we're seeing all across the globe are domestic and global terrorism activities at mass gatherings. And we're seeing a number of these different cases. The challenge now with social media is the minute these activities are happening, we're hearing about them halfway across the world before responders can even get to those events. So we have an increased challenge now. Not only do we have added risks that we didn't have to think about before, but now we have other ways, new ways to think about communicating with people, and also challenges of misinformation being tweeted out or shared through social media as well. And we'll talk a little bit about how we deal with misinformation and rumors through social media and how that's actually helping us now with social media. Now, some of you might have heard this quote before. It's a famous crisis communications quote that we use a lot, which is a famous Japanese proverb that's basically the reputation of 1,000 years may be deterred by the conduct of 1 hour. And I would say that now in the new era of social media, I would scratch out that 1 hour, and I would really say within a few minutes, because we are seeing now with the era of social media that, as I mentioned, and everybody knows now, the minute an event happens halfway across the world, someone is hearing about it before your organization probably potentially is even in preparation mode to be able to respond to it. This is why we are even more challenged now to be able to get accurate information out as quickly as possible and to be the first source of credible information. And we'll go into a little bit more about how to be that credible source and that first source of information. But first, let's talk a little bit about a few case studies of what perhaps not to do. And we're going to talk about spokespersons specifically for a second here. And I'm going to ask the question, and you don't have to respond, but for those of you who might want to type in your answer, does anybody recognize who this fellow is? And a lot of people, unfortunately, recognize this fellow's image because of something he didn't do too well, which was he had some crisis communications messaging that appeared to be not very representative of, not very empathetic of people during the BP oil spill specifically. So for those of you who didn't recognize who this gentleman is, he is the former CEO of BP Oil, Tony Hayward. So now for those of you who know who this is, I'm sure most of you remember what got Tony into trouble, and rightfully so, after the BP oil spill, was a statement that he made in the media when he was being interviewed. And basically, his statement was, "No one wants this over more than I do. I just want my life back." Of course, that is not something that should be said by the spokesperson of a major organization that is involved in a serious environmental oil spill that put hundreds and thousands of people at risk. It was a horrible, horrible experience for BP Oil, but made much, much worse because of the words that their CEO and spokesperson said that day. Now, let's take a look for a second at this. Does anybody recognize this image? This was something that happened a couple of months ago. I'm sure that this will jog your memory. United Airlines. I wanted to talk about this image for a second because I think it really represents what we don't want to happen in an organization. Now, if you recall, a couple of months ago, we had the unfortunate incident of a passenger being asked to deplane, and they refused to. Therefore, they were dragged off the plane. So the gentleman with the glasses is the person, a doctor, who was dragged off the plane. It ended up that because United Airlines took a while before, one, showing any kind of sympathy or issuing any kind of direct apology to everybody who had been inconvenienced, including the passenger in that plane. But it took several hours for the United Airlines CEO to respond at all to this event. And instead, because of that, this gentleman who was dragged along the aisle ended up being the unofficial face of United Airlines that whole week, if you all recall. I can't remember how many times I saw this image of this man, and unfortunately that became representative of United Airlines for that week, and that became the story. The inset picture is the CEO of United, Oscar Munoz, but I think that everybody really recognizes the image of this man a lot more than the CEO, unfortunately. This could have been a time for United to be able to use this as an opportunity, for them to be able to show compassion, to show that they cared for their customers and for their passengers, and to show what they were going to do to investigate this and make sure that this kind of thing does not happen again for the safety and security of all passengers. Unfortunately, they did not go about this immediately in the right way. They eventually were able to come back and have some really good messages, but it took them several days, and by then it was just too late. So based on some lessons learned from these and other disasters, deal with human suffering first. Empathy is key, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. And here are some other tips. Remember, every decision you make has its consequences, and you may not be viewed by everybody as making the right decision, but if you believe it's the right decision that you need to make, then make that decision and let everybody know what you're doing. Align your actions to your words. Assume also you won't be able to communicate. A lot of major disasters that we've been in, our communications channels have broken down. Because of that, obviously, we want to make sure that we have backups to our backups to our backups, as we always do in our business continuity and emergency response plans. We're really great at recognizing that we need backups to backups. We might need to maintain off-site facilities. Another issue that's very important, I believe, is nothing says concern and control like placing a leader at the scene. I'm sure a lot of you remember incidents that you've seen covered in the news where if the person, the leader or the CEO or the spokesperson of the organization who's involved or responsible for the disaster is not there, it doesn't bode well. It does not reflect well on the organization. Number 7, I believe, is one of the #1 issues. Be the first to report your news. Even if it's bad news, be the first to report it. If you're not, and reporters can't find you to share your story and to turn it into turn the story into what you want it to be, then someone else is going to be sought out to make a comment instead, and they might own the story. And you don't want that to happen. You want to be able to own and control the headline and the story. And another thing now, over the past 10 years anyway, is we need to make sure that we monitor not only traditional media, but also social media. And we should have at least a couple of people trained to be able to do that. I'm not saying that it should be business continuity planners or emergency managers. We have our own roles, our own critical roles to be responsible for during an emergency. But we're going to take a look a little bit later at the types of people that we could be considering to be able to be trained and called in during an emergency to be the ones to disseminate messaging through social media or also to monitor social media. 5 steps to success when it comes to crisis communications. Have a solid communications plan. And hopefully all of you have a communications plan. If you don't, there are a lot of communications plan templates out there, a lot of people who could help you develop a solid communications plan to make sure that you have something in place that you can reach for if something does happen. Be the first source for information, as I mentioned. Show competence and expertise as you're responding to and recovering from the incident. Remain honest, open, and truthful, and that's going to come up throughout. And of course, as I mentioned before, express empathy early. And unfortunately, that was a huge mistake by United Airlines in that example we spoke about earlier, was empathy was not expressed early on. And that was an unfortunate event for United Airlines. Some common sense principles in communications. Acknowledge that the crisis has happened as soon as you can. Put people first. It's all about humans. Make sure that you're putting people first and you're showing that you're caring for people and what you're doing to assist people who've been affected by this crisis. Another common sense principle, make sure that you've got key messages in place. this is a perfect time to be able to decide on not only what you need to be communicating to people, whether it's directives on what they need to do, where they need to stay away from, but also key messages on your key values as an organization as well. Take responsibility for and own the crisis. If you are part of the crisis, you must own the crisis. Deliver solutions from the top, and if you make a promise, deliver on it. Now, what is going to equal successful communication for any organization or community is credibility and trust. How do you gain credibility? Provide accurate information as quickly as possible. Increases your credibility. Showing empathy and openness shows people that they can trust you, and those two aspects will equal successful communication, being credible and trustworthy. Let's take a look at an event that happened a few years ago in 2013. Some of you might recall the airline crash that happened at San Francisco Airport. This was Asiana Airlines crash. It was in June 2013. You may recall that there were 2 people on site who died, 2 passengers who died from this crash, and the 3rd who died in the hospital several days later. The unfortunate event, this was a horrible tragedy, but what was worse with this event specifically, and I wanted to mention it to people, was how long it took Asiana Airlines to respond at all, or to even acknowledge that they were involved in this accident. It took them over 6 hours to make any kind of statement whatsoever to their stakeholders, which of course now in the era of social media is completely unacceptable. You had other airlines, you had San Francisco Airport, you had the Transportation Authority, you had so many other people from all over the world who were sending out messages of condolences and who were informing people about what was happening on the scene, and yet not a word was said by the actual airline that was involved in this incident, which was very, very unfortunate. Now, let's talk a little bit about another little case study that I'm sure all of you remember, but it seems like it was a while ago now, the exploding Galaxy phones. And it's funny because every time I have a presentation somewhere and I show this slide up, I'll ask the group, how many of you have ever had a Galaxy Note 7? And every single audience I'm in front of, no one ever says anybody ever had a Galaxy Note 7. So I have no idea who actually owned any of these exploding phones, but apparently some people obviously did. And it created some very, very critical events, including this image that you're seeing right here where it ignited a Jeep. Unfortunately, Samsung also took its time in communicating to their customers after that crisis. It took them several weeks before they gave messaging to their clients on what they were going to do to be able to replace people's phones that were exploding. What they did and how they chose to communicate was not what you would normally think about either. They decided, well, they're going to write a little note on their website on the top, on the bottom right corner. There's a little note, and it was very, very nondescript. And you had to really look for it and search for it to find it. And in there was a note, and it wasn't a really human kind of human written note. It was much more official, and there really wasn't any sincerity in it. And you had to go looking for it to find the message in the first place, which is not what you want to do. You want to get your message out there in as many ways as possible, in as many forms as possible, so that as many people as possible see your messaging. Not hide it away in your website somewhere and let people eventually find it. The bottom line, show you care, especially if you or your clients or your customers are directly affected by a crisis, but even where appropriate, if you're not, it's also important to show you care. If you're a community or company that's near somewhere that's involved in a crisis, you may still want to be able to show you care, reach out and be human. Here are some ways you can do that. This is a perfect opportunity for you to be able to show your clients, your customers, your stakeholders that you care and that you're doing something to help. Again, this is an opportunity. You have now an opportunity to turn that crisis into an opportunity to be able to reflect your culture, your company, and show that you're a human and you care. Okay, we've got another poll. So from the list below, rank these crisis management and communication principles in the order that you feel they are most important to least important.
So it's possible that you can't actually rank them. Maybe choose your top 3. So that, I'm sorry about that. The tool would not allow us to rank things, but you can choose maybe your top 3. So we should have changed the directions. My apologies.
Unmuted.
It looks like we have a bit of a tie here. Truthfulness as well as responsiveness and engagement of stakeholders at 65%. 87% believes transparency, trust, and empathy would be, so actually that would be first. Truthfulness and responsiveness is second with a tie. And third is openness and accessibility.
Great, thank you. And that is not surprising at all that those choices were made and those rankings were made. All right, so let us now go into some key communications decisions, then we'll talk about the steps of crisis communications before we get into a bit more about social media in emergency management. All right, our key communication decisions. When something happens, we need to know what we need to release, when we need to release it, how, where, whom, and why, all of those, the 5 W's that we learned back in school. So now let's talk about the 10 steps of crisis communications quickly before we go into a bit more on social media and emergency management. Well, now, anticipate crises. This is something that hopefully we can try to do if you're aware of your organization's risks, as well as chatter out there. We're monitoring social media, we're monitoring traditional media. We're aware of the risks, the history of our organization, of where we are, just anticipating what we might face as an organization. Have a trained crisis communications team. Obviously very, very key, and it depends on the size of your organization. That might be a public information officer / media liaison all in one, and then you might have one person monitoring the media, or 2 hopefully, and then a couple of backups for each. As we mentioned before, we're all about backups obviously, but it all depends on how large or small your organization is. So you may very well have dual, you may have dual roles for one person, or you may have the ability to have several different roles in your team, but that's important for you to recognize who you need on your crisis communications team and make sure you appoint the right people and train them accordingly. Have a crisis communications plan, and hopefully most of you have a crisis communications plan. I'd encourage you after this session, whenever you have a chance, maybe to pull out that crisis communications plan, have a look at it, go through it, see if there are updates that need to be made to it. If you need to enhance it a bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about one suggestion I have to enhance it if you haven't already thought of this before. Identify and train your spokespersons. That's key. We looked at a couple of examples of spokespersons in our case studies, and that really is something that's key. You really have to think about who is the right person. We talked about, and the poll showed us, that we think trust and transparency are one of the most important things for a spokesperson or for a company during a crisis. Because of that, you want to make sure that whoever you've appointed or identified that's going to be your spokesperson, and that should be done ahead of time. So regardless of what the crisis is, your spokesperson should remain the same. That should be the leader of your organization and representative of your organization. But it's also important that not only it be that person who's representing your organization as the CEO or another position, but they need to be trained and be able to reflect that honesty and openness and gain trust by their stakeholders and the public. If they don't have that trust, if something's happened in the past where they've lost that trust or they need to regain it, you may need to think about maybe revising who you've identified as your spokespersons. And you may want to rethink and look at maybe it isn't the CEO that'll be the best spokesperson in every incident. Perhaps it's someone else that we have in our organization that is a leader who is really trusted, really well spoken, has perhaps a lot of media training or background and feels comfort in front of the media. Those are things I really think that people really need to take a look at, especially now when we've got so much focus through social media on people taking a look at what spokespersons are saying. And you can't take back a message once you've said it. That's why it's so important to not only have the right spokespeople, but have them know what they are supposed to say and give them the right tools and training to be able to make them really effective spokespersons. Establish notification systems. Back in the old days, 20 years ago, that was a call tree, a paper call tree for some companies or smaller organizations. Now we've got these mass notification systems. We've got these great tools that we can use. So that's something I think that we all need to consider. What are the new notification systems and tools out there that we can use to try to ensure that we can communicate effectively in as many fashions as possible and communicate and reach out to as many audiences as possible? Knowing, though, however, that we might also and we should keep those old-fashioned call tree lists as well, because we may very well have to revert to them if technology fails. Monitor traditional and social media. We talked a bit about that previously. Now more important than ever, you never know when a new tweet is going to come out with a new piece of information or misinformation or rumor. And then it's up to you to decide, once you've seen that misinformation or that rumor, how you're going to address it. Hopefully, if you've already got some kind of a social media presence and platform for your organization, you've already got some followers. You've already got people who are listening to you. Because of that, when you are monitoring and if you hear misinformation or rumors that are being distributed in the public, you can easily be able to quash those rumors or correct that misinformation as quickly as it got out there through your own social media platforms. That's why I really believe that a lot of people say that social media now is just enhancing our ability to provide misinformation and rumors. However, I believe that it also enhances our ability to shut down those rumors and misinformation, whereas in the old days, we'd have to wait till the next news cycle or the next business day before the newspaper would be able to publish a retraction or a correction or correct the information. Now we can correct information within the first 3 minutes of it being released. Identify and know your stakeholders. I think everybody does a pretty good job of this, but it's always important to go back in your crisis communications plan and take a look at who you've identified as your stakeholders. Who are going to be those main people, your audiences, your target audiences when something bad happens and you've got a crisis? Who do you need to get messaging out to? And your messaging might be different depending on the stakeholders. You've got internal stakeholders that you're going to need to create messaging for, as well as external stakeholders. The messaging may very well be different for your internal versus external. But as long as you recognize and know and list down who your stakeholders are, that'll help you be able to acknowledge who you need to speak to during a crisis and how you're going to do that. Develop holding statements ahead of time if you can. So if you've got a crisis communications plan, what I would encourage you to do, if you don't have it already, is to have some blank statements, holding statements like this one that you're seeing in front of you, or a news release, or different things that you can prepare ahead of time and fill in the blanks with the actual events of the crisis at hand, so that you don't have to create everything all at once. You've got at least a template or some rough templates of communications pieces that you can quickly fill in the blanks and then send out to people. Finalize and adapt your key messages. This is key as well. Not only is it going to support your spokesperson and what they say and how they say it, but also these key messages are now going to be in every press release you have, in any press conference that you have, in people who make statements, in people who do interviews with the press. These are key. This is really going to help you develop what you want your brand to be in this crisis, and how you want to be perceived. And it's all about key messaging. Remember that one of your first key messages, if there have been humans, people specifically directly impacted, involved, deaths, injured, and others, empathy is going to be your first key message, and should always be. And that shouldn't be an afterthought, and it shouldn't be something that people need to be reminded about, but we need to be reminded about it. But as long as we know that that's first and foremost our key message all the time, and perhaps you can develop some of these key messages ahead of time too, where you've got holding key messages in place. Some of your key messages are never going to change within your organization regardless of the crisis. So have some key messages developed ahead of time so that you can pull from those when an actual crisis happens and you're not creating your key messages on the fly during a crisis. And of course, afterwards, as we always do after any event, perform an after-action report, a post-crisis analysis, and learn from what you experienced. And of course, we'll always see that we had challenges and we can improve our plan. So go back to your crisis communications plan and make sure that you refine and reform it accordingly. All right, now let's get into the last part of the presentation, which is talking about social media. Some of you might be familiar with this hashtag. It's hashtag SMEM, or social media and emergency management. So for those of you who are who want to know a bit more or find out everything there is to know about social media and emergency management, you can use this hashtag to find out more about it on Twitter. One thing I want to really emphasize to people, I think this is really important for everybody to know, because a lot of people sometimes get nervous with social media and say, well, I'm not really a Twitter guru and I don't know about Facebook. And you know what? As emergency managers and business continuity professionals, I believe that's not our responsibility to be the ones tweeting and posting on Facebook or writing in those critical crisis communications messages through whatever social media platforms we happen to be part of within our organization. But we need to be aware that we need to do it, and we need a trained team to be able to do so. Try to think about who within your organization does not have a critical role during a crisis event, but perhaps has some skills in social media or communications that may be able to help be part of that team during a crisis event. Why do we need to incorporate social media? I think at this point I don't really need to, excuse me, to convince most of you anymore. But for those of you who still need convincing, things have really changed over the last 10 years with social media. Before, we'd have an event, responders would show up, and then the media would show up, we'd hear on their scanners, we'd show up to the event, and then we would report to the rest of the world. And that's how the news got out. Now, social media has changed the game completely. Now we're seeing, as with that Asiana Airlines crash and any other incident that we see online or on television these days, people halfway across the world are now seeing images of an event that's happening on the ground somewhere before responders can even get to the event. Because of that, we really need to adapt our crisis communications plans accordingly and ensure that we include social media within it. Also with social media, it's changing the way that we communicate and how people expect to be communicated with during a crisis. Before, during a crisis, it was really one-sided, where the organization who was responsible for communicating to people would send messaging out. This is what you're to do. We would be talking to as opposed to talking with people. We'd be sharing information and broadcasting that externally. Now with social media, if you're realizing, it's much more of a two-sided or a two-way conversation. If you notice, you tweet something out or you post something on Facebook, and now people in the community or your clients are posting back, and they're posting questions, or they're tweeting questions or comments, and they're expecting that you're going to communicate back to them in the same form. So very much changes the game now, where it's not just one-sided. People are expecting, and we should be able to respect that. Now, people want to be responded to and listened to. And if they post something and they post a question, we should be replying to them. All right, some pros and cons of social media, and we've talked about some of them already. And this is one that comes up quite a bit, where I'll get people who say, well, what about those who aren't connected? Not all of us are connected. And that's true. There are a lot of people who are not connected. However, indirectly, I would argue that every single one of us, either directly or indirectly, are now getting our information through social media, because our traditional news outlets now are getting their information through social media. So indirectly, those people who are watching their news, let's say on television or listening to the radio, where are those stations getting their news? They're getting them from social media. So indirectly, everybody who's listening to whatever traditional formats of news sources they refer to, those are coming most of the time through social media accounts as well. And let's use an example for a second. I've had this before too. Well, my grandmother, doesn't use Twitter or Facebook. And that's true. That's why we're not saying that we should only use social media now to be able to communicate during a crisis. Not at all. But now it's just an additional tool that we have to be able to try to reach as many people as possible. Also, let's say I have a senior friend who isn't connected, and it may not be a senior, but someone who's not connected socially through methods of social media. However, I am. So if I get a tweet and it's something about a crisis that I know is in a neighborhood near, let's say, my grandmother, I'm going to now either walk over or pick up the phone or whatever traditional way I would communicate with that person. I will get that message, but I will get that message because I found out about it quickly through social media. So again, as you can see, indirectly, even those who aren't connected are getting use and benefit from the quickness of social media. Here's another challenge, and some of you might remember this, most of you maybe not, because they did a really good job of dealing with this as soon as it happened. The Associated Press, after the Boston bombings, their Twitter account was hacked, and the hacker had tweeted afterwards through AP that the White House was attacked and the president at the time was potentially injured. Within 5 minutes, AP was able to acknowledge that they had been hacked, and then they sent this message out as a result. So as quickly as they were hacked, they were able to acknowledge it, recognize it, and then send this out and deal with it. And now, Associated Press is not, most people don't even remember that this event happened. So it was a challenge, but it was dealt with, and no one even remembers that it was there. Now here's another challenge. I just thought I'd throw this in. And it is a challenge, though, that some of us are experiencing through drills and exercises now, too, with social media. Everybody's got their phone and tweeting about their being evacuated. That's something, though, I mean, it seems silly, but I think it's something that we need to just reinforce when we're doing our drills in our organizations and our businesses as well, is to let people know, our staff know, not to be using their phones when they're evacuating. I just think that's really important to be. So if anybody wants to use this or steal this image to be able to include in their training drills, that would be great. Another thing that we noticed, and just quickly, some of you might have seen these images before. These images pop out Whenever there's a major flooding crisis in a major urban area, I find, and these are obviously photoshopped, but some of you might have seen these in your own areas if you've had a massive flood before. One of the challenges with social media, we now see visual rumors. So these are what I call visual rumors, where now people are tweeting these kinds of images out because they look, oh, this looks cool, sharks are in the mall. But really, we've always had rumors whenever there's a crisis. Now, yes, with social media, we have visual rumors, but we just need to remember, don't believe everything you see or read on the internet or otherwise. And here's just another slide to remind you all of that. All right, now let's get into our last piece on implementing or thinking about implementing a social media strategy or component within your crisis communications plan. I'm not going to go through all of these, but at least you have a slide here. If you want to develop a social media strategy, this will give you some good direction on what to include in that strategy. But just overall, what to include in your social media strategy? What's your organization trying to achieve through social media? Do you have a social media presence and platforms? To what level do you want to engage in social media? Do you want to perhaps make different levels where in level 1 you're going to monitor only, or level 2 you're going to monitor and respond to select posts or tweets that you see, depending, is it misinformation that you want to address or correct? Is it a rumor that you want to address? Level 3, etc. So think about that. Consider levels of activation and deactivation and decide in advance what your organization will or won't respond to. And you may very well know that in advance. Include your employees in your plan. During an emergency, your employees can help you push your messaging out to the public. Let them know ahead of time what's expected of them during an emergency. If you have a Twitter account, do they follow you on Twitter? Encourage your employees to do so in advance so that when a crisis happens, then they can tweet and retweet to all of their followers and so on, so you get a much further reach. We talk about staffing for social media, something to consider. Who is going to be part of your social media team? And I don't believe it should be anybody that already has critical roles during an emergency. But take a look at who doesn't have critical roles during an emergency, but has the skill sets required to be able to be an effective social media monitoring person or messaging person. And also run tests of how you're going to use your social media. Make sure that you train people, you have a team ready, and that you look at how you're going to be using social media effectively. Another thing that I encourage, and this is something that still surprises me a lot, is that a lot of people still don't include injects, social media injects, in their exercises. And now, if you don't have at least a couple of social media injects in any kind of exercise, whatever it is, you're not reflecting today's reality. Because as we know, every single crisis is going to have some random tweet coming out on it, or some Facebook post, or something through social media that's going to be shared that at some point you're probably going to have to deal with in any kind of a crisis event. That's why it's really important to ensure that every single exercise that you have, every single tabletop or otherwise, you have at least a couple of social media injects in there. Otherwise, you're not reflecting reality. And it's important then that your executives are aware. If you're throwing these injects into an exercise, then you're letting them know this is reality now. And these are things that if they don't choose to deal with them during a crisis, they could create the next crisis. And we've seen that before. By someone not responding quickly to a crisis, creates the next crisis, creates the next headline for your organization, and you don't want that to happen. You don't want your inaction to create the next crisis. All right, we've got our last poll. Social media is here to stay. And do you consider it a benefit or a challenge to an organization?
So Suzanne, while they're taking that poll, we had a couple of questions come in.
Sure.
One is a question that said, is it not correct that the CEO should only deliver good news? The CEO shouldn't be the plan spokesperson, or has that changed? And then the second one was more of a comment and says that it's very important to make sure your key messages are approved in advance so that communicators have the authority to act rapidly. I have a comprehensive message matrix for a variety of possible scenarios which are approved. Waiting can be a reputation killer. You must respond to the first hour, as the speaker indicated.
Yes, that's excellent. So I'll speak to the second point and then go to the first point. That's great, that idea of having a message matrix and having those key messages approved in advance so that you're not running around getting approval at the last minute, which will delay your promptness in getting them out as well. So that's an excellent point. That's a great tool, that key message matrix. I really like the sound of that. So great idea for the organization who has thought to do that. And it would be great if every organization would do that. It'd be great if every crisis communications plan has an appendix with a key message matrix. And then whether a CEO should only deliver good news versus bad news, I don't agree with that, because your spokesperson should be delivering the news regardless. You're delivering the response, what your organization is doing to respond to the event. So there'll be some good news, there'll be some bad news, but regardless, your spokesperson should be the same. The messaging will be different, but your spokespersons should be the same. They should be reflective. And if some kind of leader within your organization, it may not even be the CEO, but someone else that you know people trust and respect, not only within your organization, but outside of your organization as well. And that spokesperson, yeah, they'll be tasked with delivering both the good and the bad. If you think for your organization that you don't think you don't want your CEO, or your CEO doesn't want to deliver the bad news, then perhaps that's something that you should be deciding and talking about ahead of time as well, on when you're looking at selecting the right spokespersons for your organization. So it might be different depending on the organization. But overall, your spokespersons should be the ones delivering all your messaging, whether it's good or bad.
And Suzanne, just to wrap up the poll, 61% believes that social media is a benefit to organizations, 31% perceives it as a challenge, and 88% is a little bit unsure there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, to end this, I'm just going to share with you a few resources that I would recommend for those of you who aren't already aware of it. FEMA has an online social media and emergency management course, so I'd advise you to check it out if you haven't already. Bernstein Crisis Management is a great site as well that has a lot of great information on how to deal with crisis communications and uses some great case studies and examples. And then there's also a document called The Use of Social Media for Disaster Recovery. I've included the link here. And it's a great document that was prepared by a couple of innovative non-emergency managers from Joplin, Missouri, after the Joplin tornado. And these are two women, a mother-daughter team, who created the first ever community-based Facebook page in response to an emergency. And it was after the Joplin tornado. So I would highly recommend you look at that. I believe it's a 14-page document that, based on their experiences of creating the first ever Facebook page for a community after the Joplin tornado, they shared their lessons learned and advice and guidance on how to be able to help other communities set up these kinds of pages. In summary, any credible organization should have a crisis communications plan. If you don't already have one, start working on a social media component that to add to your crisis communications and your emergency response and business continuity plans. It's important now to harness that power of social media to hear and be heard. And if you learn the rules and understand the tools, you can use social media as part of your crisis communications plan to your great benefit. And I believe that brings us to our time, but if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out to me, please feel free to reach out anytime. My information is here, and you can go check out my website if you'd like. If you want to hear more about that story of the innovators of the Joplin tornado and many, many more, feel free to check out my book as well. And thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you again, Suzanne, for joining us, and to invite you to attend our next webinar on August 30th. It's about managing risk to the critical environment, a whole different topic, talking about your data center or other critical environment and looking at the risks to that. And I would be remiss if I didn't share that I-Corps does have a Crisis Communication Planner course. It is an instructor-led course, or it can be taught online live, that we'd invite you to check out. And we also have a Crisis Communication and Management Professional Certification, as well as an 8-course series that's part of that learning. So thank you very much again. There were a couple more questions that we didn't have time for. I will share those questions with Suzanne, and she will be able to reply to you. Thank you much for attending, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.